Yeah, let's go.
Okay.
All right, you ready, bro?
I'm going to press the play button.
All right, let's play button.
Is the screen big enough for people? Or personal?
Some of the lights up here. That's a problem. We can't hear you.
There's no sound.
Okay, so we have looked at so far the amount of interpretation that translation should do. So what we've done. Specificity. Each translation has this context. Number two should be on the board as that of confidence, whether one particular interpretation is the correct interpretation. We call it risky business. Third was intuition. Each translation has to decide what their modern readers will intuitively understand. Instead of having to try to figure it out, they just automatically know.
I'm going to restart so we can actually hear.
Good morning, brothers and sisters. Sorry I can't be there with you, but I'm glad that Steve can preach God's word to you today. We just have a little bit left in this particular section of the Sunday School series that I was teaching, so instead of just teaching next week, this brief section, I thought I'd just record it and have you guys listen to it, because it's not going to be very long anyway. Okay, so we have looked at so far the amount of interpretation that translation should do. We've done several different categories. Specificity, in other words, each translation has to decide to what extent it needs to specify something in the text or context. Number two, which should be on the board, is that of confidence, whether one particular interpretation is the correct interpretation. We called it risky business. Third was intuition. Each translation has to decide what their modern readers will intuitively understand. Instead of having to try to figure it out, they just automatically know what that understands. And the fourth one, if you think about it, makes a lot of sense, and it's that of tradition. Each translation has to make thousands of choices to retain a traditional rendering or to diverge from the traditional rendering in order to best communicate meaning. So it's just like that famous song from Fiddler on the Roof, tradition, tradition. And that's has a huge impact upon translation of a different Bible version. So take Matthew 6:9, for instance. You're welcome to flip to any of these that I mentioned here. Matthew 6:9. So the traditional rendering is, hallowed be your name, or hallowed be thy name. And that's the ESV uses, that's the NIV uses, but do people really know what hallowed means? It could even be misunderstood as hollowed, for its homonym. Hollowed meaning hollowed out, taking the contents of the inside out. So what versions like the CSB do is they translate it as, your name be honored as holy. Or take Psalm 23:1, very famous one. The Lord is my shepherd, quote, I shall not want. That's King James, New King James, and ESV. But I used to think, and I know I'm not the only one like this, that it meant I don't want my Lord as my shepherd. The Lord is my shepherd. I shall not want him. So I was really confused as a child why anyone would not want the Lord as their shepherd. But of course, that's not what it means. The vernacular is something like the NIV, I lack nothing, or the CSB, I have what I need. Or think about the Ten Commandments. The rendering in the King James is, thou shalt not kill, for the sixth commandment. Thou shalt not kill. But what about war? What about self-defense? What about capital punishments? Well, the answer is that the King James translators did not mean kill as we know it today, as just any broad kind of killing, person who happens to have died. No, it's referring to the Hebrew word for the intentional and malicious killing of someone, meaning murder. The Hebrew word means murder, and that's why modern translations use the word you shall not murder or do not murder. So the commandment is not forbidding any kind of killing, but unrighteous killing. Or another example from the gospel accounts, maybe you encountered a footnote like this in your Bible translation, like the CSB and NIV, I believe, that both mention that leper or leprosy can also be any infectious skin disease. So the latter is more accurate, infectious skin disease, since not every skin disease was technically leprosy. But in order to best communicate that this is an unclean skin disease, they use the word leprosy. It has the idea of people being standoffish because they don't want to be near this kind of unclean person. So NIV and CSB, to varying degrees, use the word leprosy, and then they put a footnote that says it means more than just the specific word, medical reference of leprosy. Here's another one. Flip to this one if you would. Revelation 3:15. Revelation 3:15. The traditional rendering is this: would that you were cold or hot. That's the King James, that's the ESV. But what does that mean? Would? I doubt any of us have ever used a sentence where we start it with would. So we say something like this in the vernacular: I wish that you were cold or hot. Or, as the NIV says, I wish that you were one or the other, meaning in context cold or hot. Or the NET translation, NET, I wish that you were either cold or hot. So the benefits of the traditional rendering is this: it's not distracting. The Lord is my shepherd, I shall not want. If you know that, you know what it means, then it's warming to your heart. It's not distracting at all, and you generally get the gist of it. But the downside to using that traditional rendering is that some people are just not going to understand what that means. And increasingly so as the years and the decades and the centuries go on. What does I shall not want mean? Well, it means I lack nothing, or I have what I need. And another reason to diverge from the traditional rendering is that it's fresh. People like something when it puts a new spin on it, a new angle. They go, oh, I shall not want means I lack nothing. That really helps. The downside to retaining the traditional rendering is that sometimes it can be distracting. You wanting something in the vernacular, and all of a sudden you come across something in the traditional rendering sense, and you're like, what? That's not how it's supposed to be. It's supposed to be something that I can understand and I can sympathize and empathize with. So to use an analogy that some of you will get, some of you younger folks will get, some of you older folks won't understand this. So, The Mandalorian. Those of you who have seen Season 2 of The Mandalorian know that Luke Skywalker makes an appearance at the end of Season 2. Now, he says some things. I'm sure he says some cool things, but I could not focus on what he was saying because of the CGI. The CGI was so weird. Instead of using some sort of technology where they mapped another person's face onto a different person's face, they used just plain CGI, and I couldn't even tell what he was saying. So you can see the picture of that there, where it's distracting. Something like that is distracting. The downside to retaining that traditional rendering. It could make it harder to memorize, because it's less Elizabethan. To kind of take a step back, and I should have explained this earlier, that the reason that our modern translations like the King James, New King James, and the ESV, and even to some degree the NRSV, the ecumenical translation, retain that antiquated feeling is because it has the Tyndale tradition in mind. So the King James is what we tend to think of as it sounds majestic or magisterial. It actually comes from the Tyndale tradition, which might even come from the Wycliffe tradition, which was a century or two before that. So it has this Elizabethan, Tyndalian, King Jamesy type of feeling to it. But if you think about it, it kind of comes across like speaking out of order. It comes across, to use another Star Wars analogy, like Yoda. So Yoda does not speak, do or do not. There is no try. So he talks in a really weird way. So for instance, let me read for you what the CSB and the ESV read in Ephesians 2, 8, and 9. So the ESV says this: For by grace you have been saved through faith. Now we all know this because we've grown up to some degree with the King James influence. But the CSB says like this, for you are saved by grace through faith. So you see it takes that phrase, through faith and by grace, and it flips them. You are saved by grace through faith, rather than for by grace you have been saved through faith. It just comes across a lot more natural. So that Yoda speak or that Elizabethan speak can make it harder to memorize. Let me use some other examples. So flip to Titus 1:6. Titus 1:6. Here it is in the ESV. Let's look at one particular phrase. Children are believers. So we're talking about the qualifications of an elder and overseer, and it says that this person's children are overseers. But there's a difficulty with that wait, you have to require an overseer, a pastor, an elder, to have children who are believers when he can't make them be believers. In the original edition of the ESV, the 2001 text, there was no footnote there. Now, in the 2016 text, and maybe some of the other iterations as well, there's a footnote. So let's read what that footnote has to say. It says that you can also translate it as this, or are faithful. So, and his children are, quote, faithful. So the NIV says something like this, children who believe. It doesn't say they are believers, but they believe. And the footnote says his children are trustworthy. And I think the best translation of this comes in the CSB, which says, children who are faithful. With faithful children who are not accused of wildness or rebellion. Faithful children. That's a translation that comes across in the way that means that this particular man's children can't be wild and crazy, but they also aren't required to be believers. So if you translate it as children who believe, you keep that traditional rendering, you could be forcing people to misunderstand what's actually required of a pastor, elder, overseer. So if they all interpret, to kind of sum things up here, this is all of the previous several sections. If they all interpret, and sometimes they flip from functional versus formal, so what's the difference? And I've already kind of alluded to this before. The formal translations are going to sound more Greek-y, more Hebrew-y. And the functional translations are going to sound more like modern-day English. They're going to leave less room for misinterpretation or just not understanding what the text means because they put it into the vernacular. At very least, a translation has to have good footnotes, because this will help you as you're reading to not unintentionally misunderstand what the text might be saying. So if you don't know Greek or Hebrew, that's okay. Like, people think that, well, I need to study Greek and Hebrew. Most people don't. If you know how to use good English evangelical Bible translations, that's all you need. You can understand what each translation is doing. You can understand their pros and cons and use them all to your benefit. Okay, so that was all of that, and then next time we'll get into something a little bit different. God bless, have a great Sunday.
I guess that's it. I would ask if anyone has questions, but I'm not qualified to answer them. Thanks for being here, guys. Our guests. Are you guys from Hyde Park, or are you just from Michigan? Oh, okay.